Welcome back to the LeakyLynn pod, where one story can change a life, one diagnosis can save a brain, and awareness saves brains. I'm Lynn. I'm a surgical technologist. I'm a brain surgery survivor. I'm a cranial leak warrior. And for approximately 6 years, I lived and worked with a neurological condition that I didn't even know I had. I went to work in the operating room while my brain was leaking. I scrubbed into surgeries. I helped take care of patients. I tried to remember surgical timeouts while struggling with brain fog, memory problems. I had experienced dizziness, vertigo, headaches, balance problems, confusion, extreme fatigue, cognitive changes, and neurological symptoms. And while I was trying to understand what was happening to my brain, something else was happening too. I was being judged for every symptom I was struggling to understand. So today I'm going to talk to you about something very personal. American Disability Act, the ADA, Disability Discrimination Retaliation, and what can happen when an employee's medical condition is treated like a character flaw instead of a disability. Now, this is my story. And I want to be clear. I'm sharing my personal experience, my perspective, and my allegations regarding what happened to me. My legal claims are part of a process, and I am not here to determine the final legal outcome, but I am here to tell the truth about what I lived through. For years, I knew something was wrong with me. I just didn't know what. I had headaches, vertigo, dizziness, ear pressure, brain fog, memory problems, fatigue, the whole balance issues, confusion, changes the way I thought, reacted, and functioned, and I kept working. That's the part sometimes people don't understand about invisible neurological illness. You can still show up, you can still put on scrubs, you can still smile. You can still walk into an operating room and do everything in your power to get through the day. But showing up does not mean you're okay. And being able to function sometimes does not mean that you're not disabled. For approximately 6 years, I was trying to survive something I didn't even have a name for. I was misdiagnosed. I was told it could be migraines, vestibular migraines, allergies, anxiety, ear problems. Meanwhile, the clues were there. Mastoid effusion had appeared on imaging reports over the years over and over. I just didn't understand the significance of what I was reading. No one had connected all the pieces for me. And while my brain and body was struggling, I was still expected to function as though nothing was wrong. Working in surgery requires precision. It requires concentration, memory, communication, the ability to anticipate what's going to happen next. I loved what I did. Being a surgical technologist wasn't just a paycheck for me. It was part of my identity. But imagine trying to perform in that environment while experiencing neurological symptoms that no one could explain. Imagine struggling to remember something that you knew you should know. Imagine feeling dizzy or off balance. Imagine having trouble finding words. Imagine becoming overwhelmed more easily than what you used to. And then imagine being judged for those symptoms before you even know what's causing them. I received write-ups during the period when I was struggling with an active, undiagnosed cranial CSF leak. At the time, I didn't have the complete picture. I didn't know that I had a skull base defect. I didn't know that I had the encephalocele. I didn't know that cerebral spinal fluid was leaking from my brain. I didn't understand why my brain wasn't functioning the way that it once had, but I knew something was wrong. And instead of feeling supported, I increasingly felt like I was being documented, watched, judged, and reduced to a list of perceived failures. One of the hardest things about neurological illness is that symptoms can be mistaken for attitude. Brain fog can look like carelessness. Memory problems can look like irresponsibility. Neurological overwhelm can look like an attitude problem. Fatigue can look like laziness. Needing a moment to reset can be interpreted as refusing to work. But symptoms are not moral failures. And this is why disability awareness in the workplace matters. Because when employers and managers don't understand invisible neurological conditions, they can look at a struggling employee and see a disciplinary problem instead of a human being who may need help. My journey eventually led to 3 surgeries. And on May 13th, 2025, I underwent a mid fossa craniotomy, brain surgery. My surgeon opened my skull and repaired the defects that had allowed the cerebral spinal fluid to leak. That same evening, while I was in neuro ICU, I developed stroke like symptoms. My face became numb, my speech became affected. I had weakness on my right side. I experienced the whole peripheral vision loss. Because I had experienced a TIA before, I recognized what was happening. A code stroke was called. They couldn't give me TPA because I had just undergone brain surgery, and there was a risk for catastrophic bleeding. Thankfully, my symptoms resolved, but think about that for a moment. I had spent years working while neurologically compromised. Then I had brain surgery. Then I had a neurological emergency in the ICU. And eventually, I returned to work. I returned to the operating room, my happy place. I tried to rebuild my life, and people noticed a huge difference in me. Coworkers noticed, surgeons noticed. I was told I seemed better. I was told I was a new person, like I had a new brain because I was better. The leak had been repaired, but brain surgery doesn't erase years of illness just overnight. Recovery isn't a light switch. You don't wake up after a craniotomy and suddenly become the person you were before years of neurological symptoms. Healing takes time. Your brain has been through something enormous. Your body has been through something enormous. And emotionally, you have to process the facts that you spent years knowing something was wrong while fighting to be believed. Approximately 6 months after my craniotomy, I lost my job. And that moment changed my life. I lost my income. I lost my employer sponsored health insurance that same day. I lost security that allowed me to continue medical care after brain surgery. I had already met my deductible and out of pocket costs. And suddenly that coverage was just gone. Appointments and care had to be reconsidered or canceled. My financial stability just totally collapsed. My credit suffered tremendously that I worked so hard on. And perhaps one of the most painful parts was this. I had fought for years to find out what was wrong with my brain. I survived 3 surgeries. I survived a craniotomy. I survived a neurological emergency in the ICU. I returned to work, and then I lost my job. There is one particular incident that remains important to my story. After a conflict at work, I stepped outside for approximately 3 to 5 minutes. to breathe, to meditate, and regain my composure. I wasn't disappearing for hours. I wasn't abandoning any patients. I was trying to regulate myself so I can return and continue functioning. Initially, I was told that stepping outside and having a few moments was a good thing. But that incident later became part of the circumstances surrounding my final write up and termination. And I have had to ask myself, at what point does an employee need to manage the effects of a disability become something an employer should discuss through accommodation process instead of simply punishing? That's one of the central questions in my story. Because the ADA isn't about giving people a free pass. It doesn't mean an employee never has to meet job requirements. It doesn't mean every requested accommodation must be automatically granted. But it does mean that qualified employees with disabilities have rights. And sometimes a reasonable accommodation could be something as simple as a modified schedule, leave, a change in how a task is performed, or another adjustment that allows someone to continue doing their job. And asking for reasonable accommodation is protected under the ADA. I also remember being told to take accountability in a way that compared my situation to someone with bipolar disorder. That statement stayed with me because I had spent years trying to take accountability. I kept going to doctors. I kept searching for answers. I kept working. I underwent surgeries. I went through a craniotomy. I returned to work. There is a difference between refusing accountability and having symptoms caused by a neurological condition. Accountability does not mean pretending a disability doesn't exist. And disability rights are not avoiding responsibility. They're about making people aren't punished simply because their brain or body functions differently. This experience has taught me something that I want every person listening to understand. Your medical documentation matters. Keep your imaging reports. Keep your doctor's notes. Keep emails. Keep text messages. Document conversations. Write down dates. If you request an accommodation, consider putting it in writing. If something happens at work that concerns you, document what happened while the details are still fresh. I didn't have copies of my write-ups. And because I was experiencing significant memory problems, there were things I couldn't recall later. That's a terrifying position to be in. To know that something happened to you, but to have a brain that was struggling to preserve all the details. That's another hidden consequence of neurological illness. Sometimes the very condition to prove is a condition that made it harder for you to document and remember what was happening. After losing my job, I had to confront something even bigger. I had spent years believing that maybe I was failing. Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I wasn't capable as I thought I was. Maybe all those write-ups defined me. But then I started looking at the timeline, the symptoms, the imaging, the surgeries, the diagnosis, the neurological effects. And I realized that my story was bigger than my personnel file. I had been sick. I had been neurologically compromised. And I had still been showing up. I had still been trying. I had still been fighting. This episode isn't about saying that every workplace disagreement following someone with a medical condition is automatically illegal discrimination. It's not. Every situation has its own facts. But disability discrimination is real. Retaliation is real. And invisible neurological disabilities are often profoundly misunderstood. The law recognizes that disability discrimination can involve employment decisions, including termination, and that qualified employees with disabilities may be entitled to reasonable accommodations unless providing them would cause an undue hardship. The law also protects employees from retaliation for asserting ADA rights. But rights only matter when people know they have them. That's why I'm telling my story. If you're listening to this while you're struggling at work because of a disability, I want you to hear this. Document. Ask questions. Read your medical records. Understand your workplace policies. Learn about your rights. And if you believe you've experienced discrimination, consider speaking with the EEOC, Equal Employer Opportunity Commission, or a qualified employment attorney about your specific circumstances. Don't assume that because someone called your symptoms a performance problem, that's the entire story. Look at the timeline. When did your symptoms begin? When did your employer know? What medical documentation existed? What did you communicate? Were accommodations discussed? What happened after you asserted your rights? Those details matter. Losing my job could have been the end of my story. Instead, it became part of the reason I found my voice. I created the LeakyLynn pod because I know what it's like to live with symptoms no one can explain. I know what it's like to read your own imaging report and realize the clues were there. I know what it's like to be misdiagnosed. I know what it's like to undergo brain surgery. I know what it's like to have your confidence destroyed. And I know what it's like to start rebuilding yourself. Today, I advocate because there are other people sitting at work right now wondering why they can't think clearly. There are people being called difficult when they're overwhelmed. There are people being disciplined for symptoms of conditions they haven't even been diagnosed with yet. And there are people losing confidence in themselves because they believe every negative thing written about them. And sometimes the real question isn't, what's wrong with this employee? Sometimes the question should be, what is this person going through? What we haven't taken the time to understand. I don't know exactly how every part of my story will end yet, but I do know this. I will no longer be ashamed of what happened to me. I survived 6 years of an undiagnosed cranial CSF leak. I worked in surgery while my brain was leaking. I survived 3 surgeries. I survived a craniotomy. I survived a neurological emergency in the neuro ICU. I lost my job. I lost my insurance. I lost my financial security. But I didn't lose my story and I didn't lose my voice. If anything, I finally found it. If my story helps one person recognize that their symptoms deserve investigation, then sharing it matters. If it helps one employee start documenting what they're experiencing, it matters. If it helps one manager look at a struggling employee with curiosity instead of judgment, it matters. And if it helps one person realize that losing a job doesn't erase their worth, then this episode matters. Because one story can change a life. One diagnosis can save a brain, and awareness saves brains. I'm Lynn, and this is the LeakyLynn Pod. Thank you for listening, and remember, your diagnosis may explain your struggle. It does not define your worth. Until next time, thank you for listening.